7 signs you've healed more than you realize. Carl Jung psychology. What if you're not as broken as you think? What if the chaos, the silence, and even the loneliness were never punishments, but proof that you're healing? According to Carl Jung, true healing doesn't make you perfect, it makes you whole. These are the 7 subtle signs that you've already healed far more than you realize. Part 1. Understanding healing through the Jungian lens. In Jungian psychology, healing is not a straight line toward perfection, nor does it mean the absence of pain. Healing, according to Carl Jung, is the process of becoming whole, of integrating all the fragmented, repressed, and unloved aspects of the self that we've buried in the unconscious. Most people mistake healing for the elimination of suffering. They believe that when they are healed, they will no longer feel sadness, anger, or fear. But Jung reminds us that the goal is not to eliminate these emotions, it is to relate to them differently. The psyche is like a living organism. It seeks balance, what Jung called psychic equilibrium. When one part of us is ignored, an emotion, a wound, or a truth, the unconscious compensates by pushing that energy back into awareness through dreams, projections, or recurring life patterns. Healing begins when we stop resisting this natural process and start listening. The first sign that you've healed more than you realize is when you no longer react with the same intensity to old triggers. Something that once sent you into anger, panic, or self-blame now only stirs a faint echo. You notice the emotion, but it doesn't control you anymore. This isn't numbness, it's transformation. The emotion is still there, but its grip has loosened. Jung would say your ego has begun to dialogue with the unconscious instead of being hijacked by it. Let's take a simple example. Imagine you used to feel intense jealousy in relationships. It consumed your mind, making you suspicious, defensive, or anxious. Now when a similar situation happens, you still feel that flicker of jealousy, but instead of reacting, you pause. You ask yourself, what is this emotion trying to show me? That pause, that space between impulse and reaction, is the evidence of healing. It means you have integrated the emotion enough that it no longer rules your behavior. This shift happens because of a fundamental Jungian principle: what we resist persists, what we accept transforms. The parts of ourselves we reject, our anger, shame, fear, or envy, form what Jung called the shadow. The shadow is not evil. It is simply the container of what our conscious mind has refused to acknowledge. When you start to accept your shadow instead of denying it, those energies return to you in their pure form as strength, confidence, intuition, or emotional clarity. Healing then is less about becoming good and more about becoming whole. You begin to see that your light and darkness are 2 sides of the same soul. When you integrate them, your perception of yourself and others changes. You no longer divide the world into good and bad people. You understand that everyone, including you, contains both. This deep empathy is another sign of healing. You stop demonizing those who hurt you because you can sense their unconscious wounds. That doesn't mean you tolerate mistreatment, it means you can hold compassion without losing your boundaries. Jung often said that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. When you find yourself less irritated by people's flaws, it's not because you've become indifferent, it's because you've grown in self-awareness. You see their behavior as a mirror reflecting something you've already confronted within. Another profound sign of healing is when you no longer need constant validation from others. Earlier in life, our ego relies heavily on approval. It wants to be liked, seen, praised, or accepted. But as healing deepens, that craving weakens. You begin to realize that peace does not come from the outside. It arises when your inner masculine and feminine energies, the animus and anima, are reconciled within you. You stop seeking externally what you've started to cultivate internally, a sense of worth, wholeness, and safety. This is the early stage of what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming your true self beyond social masks and roles. Individuation doesn't happen through willpower, it unfolds through awareness. It's a dialogue between the conscious ego and the unconscious self. The more you listen to the messages from your dreams, emotions, and synchronicities, the more the unconscious cooperates, guiding you toward integration. One subtle sign that you've healed more than you think is the ability to observe your thoughts without identifying with them. Before healing, your thoughts used to define you. I am worthless, I am not enough, I always mess things up. But as awareness grows, you start to witness these thoughts as visitors, not truths. This witnessing consciousness, the capacity to observe without judgment, is what Jung called the transcendent function. It bridges the conscious and unconscious, allowing you to hold opposites without collapsing into one. For example, you can now feel sadness and gratitude at the same time. You can love someone and let them go. You can recognize your flaws without hating yourself. That emotional flexibility is a clear mark of healing. It shows that your psyche is no longer fragmented. It's fluid. Many people underestimate this stage because it feels ordinary. They expect healing to feel like constant joy or enlightenment. But Jung would say that wholeness feels like equilibrium, not ecstasy. You still experience the full range of emotions, but there's a quiet center inside that remains untouched. That quiet center is your self, the organizing principle of the psyche that transcends the ego. The ego wants control. The self wants balance. Healing, then, is the ego's surrender to the wisdom of the self. When you begin to trust that deeper intelligence, life stops feeling like chaos and starts feeling like choreography. You recognize that even painful experiences had meaning. They were guiding you toward integration. Another key insight from Jung is that symptoms, anxiety, depression, obsession are messages from the unconscious. They appear when we ignore a vital part of ourselves. Healing doesn't mean erasing these symptoms, it means decoding them. When you start asking, what is this emotion trying to tell me, instead of, how do I get rid of it, you've entered the realm of true psychological maturity. People who are healing often notice that they outgrow certain environments and relationships. This can be confusing because it feels like loss, but it's actually expansion. Jung compared the psyche to a tree. As its roots deepen, its branches spread. When you grow inwardly, your outer life must rearrange itself to match your new vibration. You no longer resonate with drama, gossip, or superficiality. Solitude becomes nourishing rather than lonely. This leads to another subtle sign of healing. You value peace more than attention. You no longer need to explain or justify yourself. You start choosing environments, conversations, and activities that preserve your energy. This isn't withdrawal, it's alignment. The healed psyche instinctively protects what sustains it. As Jung wrote, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The fact that you are aware of your wounds, patterns, and triggers means you have already healed more than most people ever will. Awareness itself is the medicine. The process of healing can feel invisible because it doesn't always come with dramatic external change. But if you can look back and see that your inner dialogue is kinder, your reactions are calmer, and your need for validation has lessened, then you are already walking the path of individuation. Your old self was built on survival. Your emerging self is built on integration. The difference is subtle but profound. The old self avoided pain. The new self learns from it. The old self sought approval. The new self seeks truth. The old self chased happiness. The new self cultivates meaning. Carl Jung believed that the purpose of human life is not happiness but wholeness. Healing, therefore, is not about fixing what is broken. It's about remembering what was never lost. The self, the divine core within. Every time you embrace an emotion you used to reject, you reclaim a piece of your soul. Every time you forgive yourself for being human, you rise closer to that wholeness. So if you're wondering whether you've healed, don't look at how happy you feel. Look at how aware, how peaceful, and how authentic you've become in the face of imperfection. The very fact that you can observe your pain without drowning in it is proof that you've healed more than you realize. Part 2. Recognizing the shadow and detaching from external validation. In Jungian psychology, no process of healing can ever be complete without confronting the shadow, the unconscious side of the personality that holds everything we've rejected, denied, or disowned about ourselves. Most people think they've healed when they feel positive all the time, but Jung would disagree. He believed that true healing begins only when you're able to look directly into the parts of yourself you once feared and say, "This too is me." The shadow is not evil. It's neutral energy potential waiting to be integrated. When repressed, it distorts reality and takes control from behind the scenes. When accepted, it becomes your greatest source of vitality and authenticity. The moment you begin to see your own contradictions clearly, your compassion and your rage, your kindness and your selfishness, your vulnerability and your pride, you're not regressing, you're evolving. You've begun the sacred work of reconciliation within the psyche. In the beginning, this can feel unsettling. The ego, which thrives on control and image, resists the shadow's exposure. It prefers the illusion of purity. But the unconscious doesn't care about purity. It wants wholeness. Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Every repeated disappointment, every toxic relationship, every self-sabotaging pattern is the psyche's way of pushing hidden material to the surface, demanding acknowledgement. When you start noticing these patterns instead of running from them, you've already healed more than you realize. Awareness itself dissolves the spell. For instance, imagine you constantly attract emotionally unavailable partners. Before healing, you might blame fate or think, "I just have bad luck." After shadow work, you recognize that this pattern mirrors your own fear of intimacy, your unconscious attraction to the familiar pain of rejection. You begin to see how the outer world reflects your inner dynamics. That realization is liberation. You no longer see yourself as a victim of circumstances, but as a participant in your own evolution. As you integrate the shadow, you start to understand that your triggers are teachers. Each emotional reaction reveals something buried in the unconscious. The anger that flares up at someone's arrogance might point to your own repressed confidence. The envy you feel toward another person's success might highlight an unlived potential within you. This process isn't comfortable, but it's profoundly healing. You're reclaiming the pieces of your energy that were locked away in denial. Another unmistakable sign of healing is emotional accountability. You stop saying, "They made me feel this way," and start acknowledging, "This emotion belongs to me." That doesn't mean you condone harmful behavior. It means you reclaim your inner authority. Emotional maturity is the ability to sit with discomfort without immediately seeking escape or blame. Jung viewed this as one of the highest forms of consciousness, the ego learning to cooperate with rather than dominate the unconscious. As this integration deepens, your relationship with external validation begins to shift dramatically. Early in life, our worth depends on external approval: parents, teachers, friends, society. The ego constructs an identity based on performance and perception. But the more you heal, the more you see that chasing validation is an endless loop that drains your psychic energy. You realize that trying to be understood by everyone is a subtle form of self-abandonment. You begin to prefer authenticity over acceptance. You notice this transformation when criticism no longer breaks you. Instead of defending yourself, you reflect, "Why does this hurt me? What part of me feels unseen?" You no longer need to prove your value because your worth has moved from the outer world to the inner one. This is a profound Jungian transition, moving from persona, the social mask, to self, the authentic core. The persona is necessary. We all wear masks to function in society. But when we mistake the mask for the self, we suffer. Healing reveals that your true essence doesn't depend on being admired or agreed with. You learn to rest in your own truth even when others don't see it. The paradox is that the less you need validation, the more magnetic you become. People sense the calm confidence of someone who no longer needs to perform. Jung described this as individuation, the lifelong process of becoming who you are meant to be, not who the world expects you to be. It requires detaching from collective approval and aligning with inner guidance. When you heal, you begin to trust the wisdom of your intuition, the voice of the unconscious communicating through symbols, dreams, and synchronicities. What once felt like coincidence now feels like communication. You begin to see meaning where there used to be confusion. Another powerful indicator of healing is comfort in solitude. Before, you might have feared being alone because silence exposed your unresolved emotions. Now solitude feels sacred. You understand that quiet moments are where integration happens. The unconscious doesn't speak through noise, it whispers through stillness. Jung often retreated to his house in Bollingen by the lake to engage in this kind of reflective solitude, calling it the space where the soul becomes visible. You might find yourself spending less time in superficial conversations and more time in self-reflection, reading, or creative expression. You start enjoying your own company because you've befriended your inner world. Loneliness transforms into solitude. Isolation becomes introspection. This subtle shift marks an immense psychological breakthrough. You've stopped running from yourself. You'll also notice that you no longer feel compelled to fix or save others. Earlier, you might have sought purpose by healing people who reminded you of your past wounds. But healing reveals that compassion doesn't mean self-sacrifice. Jung called this the wounded healer archetype, the danger of projecting one's own unhealed parts onto others. Once you integrate those parts, you realize your role is to guide by example, not by control. You can love others without losing yourself. As detachment from external validation deepens, a new kind of freedom emerges, the freedom to be misunderstood. You no longer explain your evolution to those committed to misunderstanding it. You no longer shrink to fit back into the versions of yourself that others prefer. This psychological detachment doesn't come from arrogance but from self-trust. You begin to measure your growth not by approval but by inner peace. A healed person's energy becomes calm but strong, quiet but grounded. Jung would describe this as the reconciliation of opposites, the union of conscious and unconscious, masculine and feminine strength and vulnerability. This balance manifests externally as serenity. You don't chase outcomes or force connections. You let things unfold organically, trusting the deeper intelligence at work in your psyche and in the universe. One day you notice something remarkable. You can feel emotional pain without collapsing. You can watch an old wound resurface and still remain anchored. The storm no longer drags you away because you've built a center within yourself. That center is the self-indestructible, timeless whole. The more you live from that center, the less you fear loss, rejection, or uncertainty. You realize that the external world can change, but your inner foundation remains. This realization doesn't make life easier. It makes it truer. You stop seeking happiness as a permanent state, and instead embrace life's rhythm of expansion and contraction, light and dark. You stop needing to escape pain because you understand its purpose. Every descent into the unconscious brings back new wisdom. Healing becomes less about arrival and more about relationship, your ongoing dialogue with the depths of your soul. And so when you notice that you're no longer chasing love, approval, or control, when you can stand calmly in the presence of your triggers and see them as mirrors instead of enemies, when you can look into your shadow and recognize your humanity without shame, that is not a small victory. That is transformation. That is the quiet revolution Jung called individuation, the soul's movement toward wholeness. Part 3. When silence becomes strength, the inner alchemy of healing. There is a moment in every person's psychological evolution when the need to speak, defend, or prove begins to fade. Silence, once a sign of suppression or weakness, transforms into power. In Jungian terms, this is when the individual begins to live from the self rather than the ego. It is the phase of inner alchemy, the transformation of raw emotion into consciousness. When you have truly begun to heal, your silence is not emptiness. It is awareness contained. You no longer react to everything that disturbs you because your energy has shifted from external reaction to internal observation. This is one of the most overlooked yet profound signs of healing. In earlier stages of life, the ego dominates. It demands to be heard, validated, and seen. Every disagreement feels like an attack on identity, and every criticism pierces the fragile structure of self-worth. But as integration deepens, you realize that arguing doesn't create understanding, it only strengthens polarization. You discover that your peace is more valuable than being right. Carl Jung saw this transformation as the victory of the inner witness over the impulsive ego. When your consciousness expands enough to observe the drama without being consumed by it, you have entered a higher psychological stage. This is what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold opposites without collapsing into either. It might look like withdrawal to others, but this new calm is not avoidance, it's discernment. You can engage when it serves your integrity and remain silent when it doesn't. The healed individual is not reactive because they no longer need to control perception. They understand that every person speaks from their own level of awareness. You begin to realize that you don't need to attend every emotional battle you're invited to. Your silence becomes your boundary. It's no longer the silence of repression, but of mastery, the silence that comes from no longer needing to explain your truth. At this stage, your relationship with emotions changes fundamentally. Anger, sadness, and fear are no longer enemies. They are alchemical materials, energies to be transformed, not expelled. You can feel an emotion rise and allow it to pass without judgment. This internal fluidity is a powerful mark of healing. Jung compared it to the process of turning lead into gold, the transformation of the base impulses of the psyche into conscious understanding. Consider this before healing. When someone disrespected you, you might react with immediate anger or defensiveness. Now you feel the same energy arise, but you breathe, observe, and let it pass. That inner pause, that sacred space between feeling and action, is the crucible of the soul. You've turned what was once reaction into reflection. This is why the healed person exudes a strange calmness that others can sense. They don't need to announce their growth. It radiates through their energy. Jung might say they've begun to embody the self-archetype, the symbol of totality, balance, and divine consciousness within the psyche. The more this process unfolds, the more you find peace even amid chaos. You start to see life not as a series of problems to solve, but as symbols to interpret. Every situation, every encounter carries meaning. You stop fighting the currents of existence and start floating with them. This surrender is not passive, it's trust. You realize that what once felt like punishment was guidance. The unconscious is not your enemy, it is your teacher. One of the most profound signs that you've healed more than you realize is when you can experience imperfection without resistance. Things no longer have to go your way for you to feel at peace. You understand that control is an illusion, a mechanism of fear disguised as strength. The healed mind recognizes that life's disorder has its own sacred geometry. You begin to let go, not out of apathy, but out of deep faith in the process. This emotional neutrality doesn't mean you've become detached or cold. On the contrary, you feel everything more deeply, but without losing yourself in it. You can feel pain without drowning joy, without clinging, and love without possessing. Jung would call this the emergence of psychological wholeness, the balanced union of opposites within the psyche. In this state, silence is not the absence of voice, it's the presence of understanding. You start responding to situations with fewer words but more depth. You listen not just to what people say, but to what they mean, to their unconscious motives, projections, and fears. You see behind the masks, because you've removed your own. Healing gives birth to empathy, but not the kind that drains. It's the empathy of the soul that sees suffering clearly, yet does not absorb it. You stop confusing compassion with responsibility. You can love someone deeply without feeling obligated to fix them. This is one of Jung's most important lessons. You can walk beside others in their darkness, but you cannot walk for them. You might notice that as your silence deepens, your environment changes. People who thrived on your old emotional reactivity may find you distant or different. That's because your energy no longer feeds their unconscious needs. You have withdrawn from the energetic economy of drama. Instead, you invest your attention in what nourishes your soul: creativity, nature, solitude, and meaningful connection. This is what Jung meant when he said that individuation is a kind of death. It's the death of false identities, the approval-seeking self, the rescuer, the perfectionist, the victim. When those parts fall silent, what remains is the self, vast, grounded, luminous. One powerful symptom of this alchemical silence is that you stop seeking constant emotional stimulation. Before healing, you needed noise, music, conversations, chaos, anything to distract from inner emptiness. Now you find comfort in simplicity. Sitting quietly, watching the wind move through the trees feels profound. You've learned to be present without craving constant engagement. This stillness is the same peace mystics describe as enlightenment, but Jung saw it as a psychological integration, not an escape from life, but a fuller participation in it. When your inner world is no longer at war, the outer world feels less threatening. The Jungian approach to healing doesn't promise a blissful life. It promises a real one. Silence is not the end of the journey, but the atmosphere of the self in balance. It's the space where intuition becomes louder, creativity flows effortlessly, and insight arises spontaneously. In this stillness, you start receiving subtle messages from your unconscious in dreams, coincidences, or spontaneous clarity. Jung called this the voice of the inner guide, the self communicating in symbolic language. You realize that your psyche is always talking to you, not in words, but in moods, images, and synchronicities. As silence becomes your natural state, your actions become deliberate. You move slower but with more precision. You say less but mean more. You start to value energy over explanation, essence over form. You no longer rush to fill the void because you understand the void is sacred. It's the womb of transformation where new aspects of your consciousness are born. This is why in Jungian terms the healed person feels both ancient and new at the same time. Ancient because they've integrated the archetypal wisdom of their unconscious. New because they've shed the weight of their conditioned identity. Silence, therefore, becomes the language of the soul. It's the vibration of harmony after chaos, the pause between death and rebirth. In this stage, healing is no longer something you do, it's something you are. When you can sit in the middle of uncertainty and feel no rush to escape, when you can let others misunderstand you without resentment, when your peace no longer depends on outcomes, that is the mark of true transformation. You are no longer chasing healing, you've become it. Part 4. Living authentically, the rebirth of the self. At the deepest level of Jungian healing, something subtle but profound happens. You begin to live from truth, not fear. You no longer act to protect the ego's image or to please others. You act because it aligns with your authentic essence. This authenticity is not performance, it's liberation. It is the final sign that you've healed more than you realize, because your choices no longer come from wounds but from awareness. Carl Jung believed that the goal of life was individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are, distinct from the masks, roles, and conditioning you inherited. Most people never reach this stage because the ego resists death. It fears what will happen if it stops pretending. But those who have healed enough to let their false identities die experience a resurrection not into perfection but into wholeness. At this point, you notice that you act from inner clarity, not external pressure. You say no without guilt and yes without fear. You no longer shape yourself to fit other people's expectations because you understand that their perception of you is a reflection of their own consciousness, not your worth. This quiet confidence doesn't come from arrogance, it comes from alignment. You've made peace with the fact that you don't need to be liked to live meaningfully. When Jung spoke of the self, he described it as the totality of all that we are: conscious and unconscious, light and dark, divine and human. Healing allows you to access that totality. You no longer divide your being into acceptable and unacceptable parts. You realize that even your flaws serve a purpose. They reveal where love still needs to enter. One of the clearest signs that you've reached this stage of healing is when you can act with integrity even when no one is watching. The external moral code gives way to an internal compass, a voice of quiet, knowing that guides you toward truth, not convenience. This inner voice is not loud or dramatic. It's subtle but steady, like the hum of divine intelligence within the psyche. You've stopped outsourcing wisdom because you trust your intuition as the language of the self. This transformation also changes your relationship with pain. You begin to feel gratitude for the wounds that once haunted you, not because you romanticize suffering, but because you understand its alchemical role in shaping your consciousness. You can look back at your darkest moments and see how each one cracked your ego open, allowing light to enter. The trauma that once defined you now refines you. Jung often wrote that there is no coming to consciousness without pain. The descent into the unconscious, what he called the night sea journey, is necessary for rebirth. Every loss, rejection, or failure was part of your individuation, a symbolic death designed to bring you closer to your authentic self. When you can see the pattern behind your suffering, you transcend it. You also start to notice that you no longer chase love, you embody it. Before healing, love was transactional, a way to fill the emptiness within. Now love becomes an overflow. You love because it is your nature to love, not because you need something in return. You become capable of loving people for who they are, not for how they make you feel. Jung might describe this as the integration of the anima and animus, the inner masculine and feminine, resulting in a balanced soul that no longer seeks completion in another. In relationships, this manifests as emotional honesty. You don't manipulate or play roles to be accepted. You communicate directly with compassion, but without fear of rejection. You no longer shrink to maintain harmony, nor do you dominate to feel safe. You understand that real connection can only exist between two whole individuals, not between two halves trying to complete each other. This stage of healing also reveals itself in how you relate to the world. You begin to move through life with a deep sense of purpose without attachment to outcome. You work, create, and serve not to achieve validation, but because it feels like an expression of your soul. The process itself becomes sacred. You no longer chase success as a substitute for meaning. You allow success to arise naturally as a reflection of inner alignment. There's a lightness to your being that others can sense. You laugh more easily, even at yourself. You don't take things as personally because you understand that everyone is projecting their inner world onto the outer one. Jung's insight into projection becomes lived experience. You can witness someone's judgment without absorbing it. You see through the illusion of separation and recognize the collective dance of the unconscious. Another deep sign of advanced healing is non-resistance to change. You no longer cling to old identities, relationships, or narratives. When something ends, you let it go gracefully, trusting that what leaves creates space for what's next. You've internalized the truth that endings are not punishments, but invitations to evolution. The healed individual lives in rhythm with life's natural cycles: creation, destruction, renewal. This acceptance brings serenity because you stop fighting impermanence. Jung compared this state to the symbolism of the mandala, a sacred circle representing the order that arises from chaos. When you live from the self, your life itself becomes a mandala, fluid, balanced, self-renewing. In practical terms, this looks like confidence without rigidity, compassion without exhaustion, and clarity without control. You begin to express your creativity effortlessly because the fear of judgment no longer blocks you. Your artwork or presence becomes an authentic extension of the self. You're no longer trying to impress, you're trying to express. Gratitude becomes your default state, not because everything is perfect, but because you recognize perfection in everything. Even pain becomes meaningful. You can look at an old wound and feel appreciation not for the suffering, but for the awareness it gave you. That shift in perception marks the completion of an inner cycle, the integration of shadow and light. In Jungian psychology, this stage is called the return to self-consciousness. It's when you realize that everything you sought externally, love, freedom, validation, peace, was within you all along. The external world simply mirrored your inner state. Healing becomes less about fixing and more about remembering. remembering that you were never broken, only disconnected from your wholeness. You also begin to feel a quiet connection to something larger than yourself. Whether you call it God, the universe, or the collective unconscious, you sense a divine intelligence orchestrating life. Synchronicities, those meaningful coincidences Jung loved, become your compass. You move through life guided by intuition rather than fear. At this point, the distinction between spiritual and psychological healing dissolves. They merge into one continuum. The psychological integration of the self and the spiritual union with the divine are two ways of describing the same truth. The realization that your individual consciousness is a reflection of something infinite. You understand that healing never truly ends, because consciousness keeps expanding. But you're no longer in a rush to arrive. You've made peace with the unfolding. You live each moment as a dialogue between the known and the unknown, the conscious and the unconscious. Life becomes an experiment in awareness, a sacred play between your soul and the world. When you reach this level of awareness, you move differently. You speak with intention, act with clarity, and love without fear. You have nothing to prove and nothing to protect. The world may still be chaotic, but inside there is order. You embody what Jung meant when he said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." So the final and most profound sign that you've healed more than you realize is this: you live authentically. You walk in alignment with your truth, not because it's easy, but because you no longer know how to live any other way. Your past no longer defines you, it refines you. Your pain no longer limits you, it liberates you. You are no longer searching for the light, you've become the vessel through which it shines. Healing is not a destination, it's a return to yourself. You don't need to become someone new. You only need to remember who you were before the world told you who to be. As Jung said, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And if you've made it this far, you're already doing exactly that.